or Paris. The skyline pierced the clouds with bold, brutalist concrete towers. Cold, modern, unapologetically ambitious. These buildings were not just architecture. They were statements. Statements that the future had arrived. Inside, American oil executives, European aristocrats, and Venezuelan generals sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping Scotch whiskey and casually discussing crude prices, contracts, and the shape of the world to come. Outside, 6-lane highways stretched across the city like arteries of wealth. Cadillacs, Buicks. Brand new cars imported directly from Detroit. Not luxury items, just transportation. The Venezuelan currency, the bolívar, so strong that in parts of the Caribbean it was preferred over the US dollar. Venezuelan tourists were famous in Miami. They walked into appliance stores, pointed at a television or a refrigerator, and said, "Barato cheap, give me two." And grinding poverty. While Europe was still clearing the rubble of World War II, Venezuela had become the 4th richest country on earth by GDP per capita. Richer than Japan, richer than Spain, richer than China. It was called the Saudi Arabia of the Western Hemisphere, a modern miracle. But there was a catch. This miracle was not grown from Venezuelan soil. It was not built on domestic industry, technological innovation, or productive labor. It was injected directly into the country's veins by a foreign power. Venezuela was not just a wealthy nation. It was a company town, and the company was the United States of America. For more than 50 years, the relationship between Washington and Caracas was not merely an alliance. It was symbiotic. Venezuela provided the fuel that powered the American century, from the Jeeps of World War II to the suburban heating systems of the 1950s. American power was burning Venezuelan oil. But today, that same country looks less like a miracle and more like a war zone. The highways are cracked and empty, occupied only by aging buses dragging themselves forward on bald tires. The oil rigs in Lake Maracaibo, once masterpieces of engineering, now sit rusting, leaking black sludge into poisoned water. Millions have fled, fleeing a hunger so severe it has stripped the average Venezuelan of 20 pounds of body weight. The standard explanation we are given is simple. Socialism destroyed Venezuela. And to be clear, corruption, incompetence, and authoritarian rule did light the fire. They were the arsonists, but they did not build the house. And they were not the ones who locked the doors, keeping the fire trucks from arriving. The story we are usually told about Venezuela is clean, simple, and comforting. A charismatic socialist came to power. He spent too much money. He printed too much cash. He destroyed the economy. Case closed. And on the surface, this explanation is convenient, especially for those who benefit from believing it. It reduces one of the greatest economic collapses in modern history to a morality tale about bad ideology and worse leadership. But history is rarely that neat. Yes, Hugo Chávez and Nicolas Maduro bear enormous responsibility. They dismantled institutions. They politicized the oil industry. They tolerated and often encouraged corruption on an epic scale. They treated the economy like an infinite ATM, assuming oil prices would stay high forever. They were reckless. They were incompetent. And in many cases, they were brutal. But stopping the story there is like blaming the final spark for a forest fire while ignoring who planted the dry trees, who diverted the water, and who built the fire breaks to fail. Because Chávez did not invent Venezuela's economic structure, Maduro did not design its dependency, and socialism did not wire the country into a single resource, dollar-dependent system. That work had already been done. Long before Chávez ever gave a speech, long before the Bolivarian Revolution, long before the word sanctions entered the conversation. To understand Venezuela's collapse, we have to stop asking who burned the house down and start asking who built a house that could only survive as long as someone else kept the lights on. Venezuela's tragedy is not just one of mismanagement, it is a story of engineered dependence. The United States did not merely trade with Venezuela. It shaped Venezuela. It shaped what the country produced, what it consumed, how it earned foreign currency, how its financial system worked, and how its oil could physically flow to market. For decades, Venezuela was encouraged quietly, efficiently, and profitably to become a nation that did one thing very well and nothing else at all: extract oil, sell it north, buy everything else. As long as the political alignment remained friendly, this system looked like prosperity. Skyscrapers rose. Imports flooded in. The middle class shopped in Miami, but dependency is invisible when times are good. It only reveals itself when something goes wrong. And when Venezuela's politics turned hostile, when it attempted to assert control over its own resources in a way Washington did not approve of, that same integration became a weapon. The very systems that once delivered wealth were now used to cut it off. This is why Venezuela's collapse cannot be understood as a purely internal failure. It was not just the result of bad policy choices. It was the consequence of a country being fully plugged into a global system it did not control, and then being abruptly disconnected from it. This is the core argument of this story. The United States helped build the most promising economy in the global South. But it built it in a way that made it structurally fragile, addicted to oil, dependent on dollars, and vulnerable to financial pressure. When the political relationship broke, the system didn't bend. It snapped. And to see how that trap was set, we have to go back, not to Chavez, not to socialism, but to a forgotten, muddy oil field in the early 20th century. Because this story does not begin in skyscrapers. It begins in the mud. At the dawn of the 20th century, Venezuela barely existed in the global imagination. It was not an industrial power. It was not a trading hub. It was a fractured agrarian backwater, a country of coffee and cocoa plantations cut apart by mountains, jungles, and disease. Malaria was everywhere. Infrastructure was almost non-existent. Political power belonged to local strongmen and warlords who ruled through violence rather than institutions. Venezuela was poor, isolated, and forgotten. Then, in 1914, history erupted from the ground. On the eastern shores of Lake Maracaibo, a drilling operation struck something extraordinary. A column of black crude oil blasted into the air with such force that it rained down for days. It was the kind of discovery that does not just change an economy, it reorders a nation's destiny. But Venezuela faced a brutal reality. It had oil, and absolutely no ability to extract it. There were no modern drills, no refineries, no pipelines, no tankers, no trained engineers. Oil without capacity is not wealth, 'tis a liability. At the time, Venezuela was ruled by Juan Vicente Gómez, a ruthless military dictator who understood power better than ideology. Gómez had no illusions about self-sufficiency. He knew he was sitting on a fortune he could not touch, so he made a decision that would define the next century of Venezuelan history. He invited the Americans in, not cautiously, not temporarily, but completely. Gómez worked hand in hand with American lawyers to draft Venezuela's petroleum laws. These laws were astonishingly generous to foreign capital. They offered extremely low taxes, long-term concessions, and near-total control over extraction and operations. The message was clear. Come, take the oil, build everything. And they came. Standard Oil, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell. The giants descended on Lake Maracaibo almost overnight. But they didn't just build oil rigs. They built a country inside a country. Because Venezuela had no infrastructure, the oil companies constructed it themselves. Roads, ports, power plants, hospitals. Entire towns sprang up around the oil fields, fenced-off communities that were legally Venezuelan soil, but culturally American. Inside the oil camps, life looked nothing like the surrounding countryside. There were baseball diamonds where Venezuelans learned a foreign sport, commissaries stocked with Hershey bars and Coca-Cola, cinemas playing Hollywood movies under the tropical night. This was not just economic development. It was cultural transplantation. While the rest of South America played soccer, Venezuela fell in love with baseball. While neighboring countries drank wine or chicha, Venezuelans developed a taste for Scotch whiskey. A new class emerged. Venezuelan engineers, accountants, and managers trained by American firms. English-speaking, technically competent, and increasingly aligned, not with Latin America, but with the United States. They did not see Washington as an imperial master. They saw it as a partner, a model to emulate. By the 1940s, the transformation was complete. World War II sealed the bond. When Nazi submarines threatened Atlantic shipping lanes, Venezuelan oil became a matter of national survival for the United States. The U.S. Navy patrolled the Caribbean to protect tankers. Ensuring the flow of Venezuelan crude was no longer just business. It was strategy. Venezuela became the gas station of democracy. Oil royalties flooded into government coffers, and for the first time in its history, the Venezuelan state was rich. But it was a distorted kind of wealth, because beneath the surface, a quiet disease was spreading, one that economists would later give a name: Dutch disease. The oil sector was so profitable that it sucked capital, talent, and attention away from every other part of the economy. Why farm coffee when drilling oil paid 10 times more? Why build factories when a strong currency made imports cheaper than domestic production? Venezuela slowly stopped producing, started buying. The country became wealthy and helpless at the same time. It had traded economic sovereignty for a lease on prosperity, and it would soon discover the price. By the 1950s, Venezuela looked like a success story that defied the rules of the developing world. Oil money poured in at an extraordinary pace. The government suddenly had more revenue than it had institutions capable of managing it. And with that money, Venezuela set out to modernize itself fast. This era was later described with a simple phrase: sowing the oil. Idea was elegant. Use oil revenues to build a diversified industrial economy that would one day stand on its own. Highways were laid across the country. Massive hydroelectric dams rose from the jungle. Universities expanded. Steel, aluminum, and petrochemical plants were constructed. On paper, it looked like a textbook development strategy, but in practice, the dependency only deepened. Oil dollars pushed the Venezuelan currency higher and higher. The bolivar became so strong that importing goods was cheaper than making them at home. Domestic manufacturers couldn't compete with foreign products priced in devalued currencies. Factories closed, farms emptied, local industry withered. Why make shoes when you could import better ones from Miami for half the price? Why grow food when oil money could buy it instantly? Venezuela became a consumer nation. The country did not collapse because it lacked money. It collapsed because it stopped producing anything other than oil. The middle class flourished, at least on the surface. International travel became routine. Miami malls became a second home. Foreign brands filled Venezuelan supermarkets. Life felt modern, comfortable, secure. But this prosperity was thin. It rested on a single assumption: the oil would never stop flowing and the prices would never fall. By the 1960s and 1970s, Venezuela had achieved something rare: a stable democracy in a region plagued by coups and dictatorships. Power rotated between parties. Elections were held. Institutions, while imperfect, functioned. Yet beneath the political stability lay a fragile economic core. Oil accounted for an overwhelming share of government revenue and export earnings. The state did not tax its citizens meaningfully. It taxed oil instead. This broke the feedback loop between citizens and government accountability. The people paid little. The state spent lavishly, and no one asked hard questions. Then the world shifted. In the early 1970s, the balance of power in global energy markets began to change. The Middle East rose in importance. And in a moment of deep irony, one of the architects of that shift was Venezuelan. Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, Venezuela's oil minister, helped create OPEC. He understood that oil-producing nations were being exploited by the so-called Seven Sisters, the Anglo-American oil cartel that controlled prices and supply. OPEC's goal was simple: restrict supply, raise prices, reclaim sovereignty. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent shockwaves through the global economy. Prices exploded. Venezuela did not participate in the embargo against the United States, but it benefited enormously from the price surge. Suddenly, the government was drowning in cash. This was Saudi Venezuela. President Carlos Andrés Perez presided over an unprecedented boom. The state nationalized the iron industry. It subsidized food. It subsidized transportation. Gasoline was practically free. Thousands of Venezuelans were flown to universities in the United States on government scholarships. The future looked limitless. And then came the ultimate assertion of sovereignty. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. The American flags came down from the oil camps. The Venezuelan flag went up. And PDVSA Petróleos de Venezuela was born. In most countries, nationalization is violent. In Venezuela, it was transactional. The government compensated the oil companies. More importantly, it signed technical service agreements that kept them deeply involved. The American firms stayed. They kept the technology running. They kept the marketing channels open. PDVSA was designed to function exactly like a private American corporation. Its executives were often the same men who had worked for Exxon and Shell. They wore suits, played golf, and prized efficiency above politics. They proudly described PDVSA as a state within a state. And in many ways, it was efficient, profitable, and completely disconnected from the poverty expanding in the shantytowns surrounding the glittering cities. Washington was comfortable with this arrangement. As long as Venezuelan oil flowed to refineries in Texas and Louisiana, ownership on paper didn't matter. The machinery of dependency remained perfectly intact. And then, as always in commodity economies, the cycle turned. In the early 1980s, oil prices collapsed. The dream shattered. Venezuela had borrowed heavily against future oil revenues. When prices fell, the government was suddenly insolvent. On Black Friday, 1983, the Bolívar crashed. Savings evaporated overnight. The middle class was wiped out. Trips to Miami stopped. Imported luxury vanished. And for the poor who had watched the skyscrapers rise without ever entering them, the reckoning was far worse. They still lived in ranchos' precarious brick shacks clinging to the hillsides, often without running water or electricity. They had seen the wealth, but they had never touched it. The illusion was gone. All that remained was anger. By the late 1980s, Venezuela was a country living with a lie it could no longer afford. The oil boom was over. The debt remained. For years, the government had borrowed aggressively, using future oil revenues as collateral. When prices collapsed, those future dollars never arrived, but the obligations did. Interest payments ballooned. Foreign reserves vanished. The state was running on fumes. Desperate, the government did what indebted countries across the developing world were trained to do. It went to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF did not see Venezuela as a social experiment or a political project. It saw a balance sheet. And the prescription was familiar. Austerity, subsidies had to go. Spending had to be cut. Markets had to be liberalized. For decades, Venezuelans had lived in a country where gasoline was cheaper than water, where public transport was heavily subsidized, where food prices were kept artificially low by oil money. Now, almost overnight, that social contract was torn up. In February 1989, the government announced sharp increases in fuel prices and public transportation fares. For the middle class, it was painful. For the poor, it was catastrophic. The response was immediate. The poor descended from the hills. What followed became known as El Caracazo. Shopping malls were looted, supermarkets were stripped bare, buses were burned in the streets. This was not organized revolution. It was raw survival. Decades of resentment, of watching wealth flow past them and never reach their hands, exploded in a matter of hours. The government panicked. It sent in the military. Soldiers were ordered to restore order by any means necessary. They opened fire on their own citizens. Bodies were buried in mass graves. The official death toll was kept deliberately vague. Independent estimates range from hundreds to several thousand killed. This was the moment the old Venezuela died. The illusion of democracy, stability, and shared prosperity was shattered in blood. The unwritten pact between the state and the people, oil wealth in exchange for political calm, was broken beyond repair. From that point on, nothing the political class said would ever be fully believed again. And inside the military barracks, someone was watching closely. A young lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chávez. Chávez did not grow up in the world of golf-playing oil executives or Miami shopping trips. He came from the margins. He spoke the language of the poor. He understood their anger, and he understood where it came from. In Ijojoar, Chávez led a failed military coup against the government. The attempt collapsed quickly, and Chávez was arrested. But before being taken away, he was allowed to speak on national television. He took responsibility, and he uttered two words that would echo through Venezuelan history: por ahora. For now. It was a surrender, but also a promise. For the poor, it was electric. Here was a man admitting failure. Here was a soldier saying what politicians never did. Chávez went to prison a nobody. He emerged a symbol. By the time he was released, Venezuela was politically exhausted. The traditional parties were discredited. Corruption scandals were constant. The economy remained stagnant. Faith in institutions had collapsed. When Chávez ran for president in 1998, he did not present himself as a reformer. He presented himself as a reckoning. He promised to tear down the old system and rebuild it in the name of the people. He promised to take the oil wealth, the same wealth that had built skyscrapers and suburbs, and finally deliver it to those who had only ever watched from below. He won in a landslide. Hugo Chávez was not just elected, he was unleashed. And with him came a direct challenge to the system that had defined Venezuela for nearly a century. The oil industry, its technocrats, and its quiet alignment with the United States. The real battle was about to begin. Hugo Chávez understood something fundamental about Venezuela that many of his critics did not. You could not control the country without controlling the oil. And you could not control the oil without controlling PDVSA. On paper, PDVSA Petróleos de Venezuela was a state-owned company. In reality, it was something else entirely. It was a technocratic fortress. A self-contained institution run by elite managers trained in the culture, methods, and priorities of American oil corporations. Its executives wore suits, not uniforms. They spoke the language of efficiency, not revolution. They answered, in practice, to global markets, not to the barrios. For decades, PDVSA had been deliberately insulated from politics. That insulation made it efficient. It also made it unaccountable. To Chávez, PDVSA was not just an oil company. It was the last pillar of the old order. From the moment he took office, conflict was inevitable. Chávez wanted oil revenues redirected toward social programs, health clinics, schools, subsidized food markets in the poorest neighborhoods. PDVSA's leadership wanted stability, reinvestment, and distance from politics. They saw Chávez as a dangerous populist who would destroy a world-class company. Chávez saw them as an unelected elite hoarding the nation's wealth. The standoff escalated quickly. In 2002, Venezuela's opposition, backed by the Business Federation, major media outlets, and sections of the military, launched a coup. Chávez was detained and flown to a military base. A business leader, Pedro Carmona, declared himself interim president. One of Carmona's first acts was to dissolve the National Assembly and suspend the Constitution. The United States government, under George W. Bush, moved with remarkable speed. It became one of the few countries in the world to recognize the coup government. In Washington, the assumption was simple. The problem had been solved, but they had miscalculated. The poor poured into the streets surrounding the presidential palace. Loyal military units regrouped. Within 47 hours, the coup collapsed. Chávez returned to Miraflores Palace, holding a crucifix, transformed from embattled president into revolutionary martyr. The lesson was burned into him. The United States wanted him gone. The elite would never accept him, and PDVSA could not be trusted. From that moment on, Chávez moved decisively. When PDVSA executives launched a massive strike. In 2002-2003, shutting down oil production in an attempt to force his resignation. Chávez responded with a purge. He fired 18,000 employees, geologists, engineers, managers, the institutional memory of the oil industry. On live television, Chávez blew a whistle and shouted, "You're fired." Politically, it was a victory. Strategically, it was a catastrophe. Those who replaced the fired experts were loyal but inexperienced. PDVSA have lost its technical brain. Maintenance declined. Investment decisions became politicized. Efficiency began to erode. At the time, few noticed. Oil prices were rising. Cash was flowing. The damage was hidden beneath abundance. With PDVSA under his control, Chávez unleashed a wave of social spending. Clinics appeared in the slums. Education expanded. Poverty and inequality fell sharply. For millions, this was the first government that had ever shown up. To his supporters, Chávez was not a president. He was salvation. But to sustain this model, Chávez needed maximum revenue. And that meant confronting foreign oil companies once again. In 2007, he demanded that all major oil projects be converted into joint ventures, with the state holding a majority stake. Most companies agreed. Two did not. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips refused. Chávez did not hesitate. He expropriated their assets, billions of dollars. Invested in heavy oil upgraders in the Orinoco Belt. The move was wildly popular at home. It was framed as justice, as sovereignty reclaimed. But beneath the nationalist celebration lay a fatal problem. Venezuela's oil is not light, easy crude. It is thick, heavy, almost sludge-like. Extracting and refining it requires specialized technology. Technology the expelled companies had provided. By kicking out the firms that possessed that expertise, Venezuela did not just make a political statement. It crippled its own production capacity. Still, no alarm bells rang. Oil was above $100 a barrel. Money masked mistakes. The party continued, and no one noticed that the foundation was cracking. For a time, it seemed as if Hugo Chávez had won. Oil prices surged through the 2000s, climbing past levels few had imagined possible. At over $100 a barrel, Venezuela was once again awash in cash. The mistakes, inefficiencies, and institutional damage inside PDVSA were buried under a flood of revenue. Production was already slipping, but slowly. Maintenance was already being deferred, but quietly. Technical expertise was already gone, but invisibly. High prices forgave everything. The government spent aggressively. Social programs expanded. Subsidized food markets multiplied. Health clinics staffed by Cuban doctors appeared in neighborhoods that had never seen a physician before. For the poor, life genuinely improved. Poverty rates fell. Inequality dropped. The Bolivarian Revolution delivered results, at least in the short term. But the economic structure beneath those gains was becoming more fragile by the year. Oil accounted for roughly 95% of export earnings. Nearly all government revenue depended on a single commodity sold into a single global market. There was no meaningful diversification, no productive base to fall back on. and Chávez borrowed heavily, confident that oil prices would remain high. The government took on massive debt, much of it owed to China and Russia, using future oil shipments as repayment. The country was mortgaging tomorrow to pay for today. Then came the cruelest twist of timing. In March 2013, Hugo Chávez died of cancer. He died at the peak of the oil cycle just before the bill came due. His chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited a system that only functioned under perfect conditions. Maduro was a former bus driver and union organizer. He lacked Chávez's charisma, his military authority, and his instinctive political control. And he inherited the presidency at the worst possible moment. In 2014, global oil prices collapsed. They fell from over $100 a barrel to under $30. For Venezuela, this was not a recession. It was a death sentence. With oil providing almost all export revenue, the collapse wiped out the government's income overnight. The debt payments remained. The social programs became unsustainable. Imports dried up. To cover the gap, the government turned to the printing press. Money flooded the economy. The currency imploded. Inflation accelerated into hyperinflation. Store shelves emptied. Basic goods vanished. Queues stretched 4 blocks. This was the moment when internal mismanagement met external pressure. In Washington, the Obama administration and later the Trump administration saw a weakened adversary. Venezuela was no longer a defiant oil power. It was a vulnerable target. And U.S. policy shifted. What had once been containment became strangulation. The economic war was about to begin. Sanctions are often described as a peaceful alternative to war. In reality, they are something closer to a siege. By the mid-2010s, Venezuela was no longer just collapsing under its own weight. It was being squeezed from the outside, slowly, methodically, and with devastating precision. The first major U.S. sanctions arrived in 2015, when the Obama administration declared Venezuela an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. The wording sounded absurd. Venezuela posed no military danger to the United States. But the language mattered. It created the legal foundation for everything that followed. At first, the measures were narrow. Targeted sanctions froze the assets of specific Venezuelan officials and restricted their access to the international financial system. On paper, ordinary Venezuelans were not the target. In practice, the signal to global finance was unmistakable. Venezuela was toxic. Banks began to sever relationships. Correspondent accounts were closed. Even transactions technically exempt from sanctions became difficult, slow, or impossible. No banker wanted to be the one who misinterpreted a rule and triggered a multi-billion-dollar fine from the U.S. Treasury. Financial fear spread faster than law. Then came 2017. The Trump administration escalated dramatically. It banned U.S. entities from purchasing new Venezuelan government or PDVSA debt. This cut Venezuela off from refinancing the lifeline of any heavily indebted state. Without access to credit markets, the government had only 2 options: default or print. It printed. Hyperinflation exploded. But the most devastating blow came in 2019. After declaring opposition, leader Juan Guaido, the legitimate president of Venezuela. The United States moved to seize control of Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset. Citgo was not just a gas station chain. It was Venezuela's gateway to the U.S. energy market. 3 major refineries and a distribution network generating billions in hard currency. The assets were frozen. Revenues were diverted away from Maduro's government. For a country already starved of dollars, this was catastrophic. Oil sanctions followed. U.S. refiners were prohibited from purchasing Venezuelan crude. PDVSA lost its largest customer overnight. Oil that had once flowed easily into Gulf Coast refineries now had nowhere to go. Production collapsed further. Tankers sat idle. Storage filled. Wells were shut in, some permanently damaged. The siege tightened. Supporters of sanctions argued that the suffering was the fault of the regime, not the measures. Critics countered that sanctions had turned an economic crisis into a humanitarian catastrophe. Both were right. Venezuela's collapse had begun long before sanctions. But sanctions accelerated it, deepened it, and locked it in. This was the modern financial war. No bombs, no invasion. Just exclusion from the global system. And exclusion in a world built on trade and credit is fatal. When a country is cut off from the formal global economy, it does not stop trading. It adapts. By the early 2020s, Venezuela had entered full survival mode. The official economy was barely functioning, but beneath it, a new system was taking shape, improvised, opaque, and deeply unequal. Oil was still being produced, just not openly. Tankers turned off their transponders. Cargoes were relabeled. Ship-to-ship transfers took place at sea under cover of darkness. Venezuelan crude flowed to China, often through intermediaries in Malaysia or other third countries. The discounts were brutal, sometimes 30 to 40% below market price, but cash, even discounted cash, was better than nothing. What remained of PDVSA became less a national oil company and more a sanctions evasion network. Meanwhile, the state turned inward. Unable to import enough food or medicine, the government expanded the CLAP food box system, monthly packages of basic staples distributed to millions of households. For some families, these boxes were the difference between eating and not eating. They were also a tool of political control. Access was uneven. Distribution was irregular. Loyalty mattered. At the same time, something unexpected happened. The government quietly loosened its grip on the economy. Price controls were ignored. The BLOV was effectively abandoned. The US dollar re-emerged, first illegally, then openly. A de facto dollarization took hold. In Caracas, dollar-priced cafes, restaurants, and boutiques began to appear. For a small urban elite with access to remittances or hard currency, life stabilized, even improved. For everyone else, it did not. The country split in two. One Venezuela lived in dollars. The other survived on bolivars and food boxes. Corruption adapted as well. Gold from the Orinoco mining arc was extracted illegally, often under the control of military units and criminal groups. It was flown out of the country in small planes or smuggled across borders, traded for cash and fuel. This was not a failed state. It was a reconfigured one. Power no longer flowed through institutions. It flowed through networks. By this stage, regime change was no longer realistic. Sanctions had weakened the state, but they had also hardened it. The leadership that remained had learned how to survive without legitimacy, without growth, and without the formal economy. And then, quietly, the world began to change. Geopolitics intervened once more. In February 2022, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Within days, the global energy system, long taken for granted, fractured. Sanctions slammed into Russian oil and gas. Europe panicked. Prices surged. Governments that had spent a decade preaching energy transition suddenly found themselves scrambling for supply. And quietly, almost awkwardly, Venezuela re-entered the conversation. In Washington, reality intruded. The United States could sanction countries, it could isolate regimes. But it could not repeal physics. Oil still mattered. With Russian barrels disappearing from Western markets, U.S. officials reopened channels they had sworn shut. Licenses were granted. Delegations were sent to Caracas. Executives from American oil companies returned to a city they had not set foot in for years. Not to apologize, not to make peace, but to negotiate. In late 2022, Chevron received permission to resume limited operations in Venezuela. The volumes were small. The conditions were strict. Most of the revenue was earmarked for debt repayment, not the Maduro government. But symbolically, it was enormous. Venezuela had survived, not prospered, not recovered, but endured. For Maduro, this was vindication. He had outlasted coups, hyperinflation, mass emigration, diplomatic isolation, and one of the most aggressive sanctions regimes in modern history. For Washington, it was an uncomfortable lesson. Financial power is immense, but not absolute. Sanctions work best against diversified economies with deep ties to global finance. Against a country willing to accept poverty, illegality, and isolation, they lose their leverage over time. And for Venezuela, the future remains unresolved. Oil production is still a fraction of what it once was. Infrastructure is decayed. Human capital has fled. Millions of Venezuelans now live abroad. The social gains of the Chávez years are gone. Yet, the state still stands. Not because the system worked, but because it adapted to failure. This is the final irony of Venezuela's story. It was not destroyed by invasion. It was not toppled by revolution. It was hollowed out slowly by dependence on a single resource, internal political warfare, and a global financial system that can punish but cannot rebuild. The war of the ledger never truly ends. It only changes form.